At 31,000 feet, somewhere over Oklahoma, a 27-year-old night janitor named June Hollis was kneeling in the aisle of a first-class cabin with a glass vial in one hand and a stranger's life in the other. The man dying in front of her, gray-lipped, collar torn open, silk tie yanked loose across a custom charcoal suit, was Rocco Belandi, 34 years old, the third-generation head of a Chicago family, most people only mentioned in a whisper. Two of his men stood over him doing everything wrong. One had already emptied an emergency injector into his boss's leg. Nothing happened, and he was reaching for a second when June pushed past him and said the thing nobody in that cabin understood. "Don't. It isn't the dose. That medicine's bad." 200 passengers had their phones up. Not one of them stepped forward. So a woman in a faded gray sweater and worn jeans, a woman who scrubbed floors at a bus terminal from midnight until morning, took a billionaire's face in both hands and told him he wasn't going to die on that airplane. 90 seconds later, she brought him back. And then she did the thing that had millions of people searching for her by sunrise. She let go of his hand, walked to the back of the plane, picked up her sleeping 4-year-old daughter, and disappeared. No name. No thank you. Not $1. Here's the part that'll stay with you. She wasn't running because she was humble. She was running because of something that happened to her 4 years earlier. Something she'd never told a living soul. And if she'd stayed in that aisle 60 seconds longer, she'd have lost the only thing she had left. What she couldn't have known, carrying her little girl down that jet bridge, was that the man whose life she'd just saved was about to hand her back the one thing she'd stopped believing she'd ever get again. If a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things is worth your time today, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs reminding that decency still exists. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment telling us where you're listening from, because it means a lot to know who's out there. Now let's go back 6 hours, to a ticket counter in Phoenix. In the morning, a woman with nothing left begged a stranger for seats on a full airplane. The phone vibrated before dawn had fully broken. Just as June Hollis reached her apartment after the night shift and before she'd even had time to take off her wet shoes, she looked at the number on the screen and knew immediately it was the hospice in Nashville, because nowhere else would call her at this hour. The woman on the other end spoke very gently, with the kind of gentleness people learn after years of delivering bad news, and said that Ruth Vandermeer had awakened during the night, asking where her little June was, and that if June wanted to see her, she should come now and not wait until the weekend. June stood motionless in the kitchen, her hands still smelling of floor cleaner, and heard herself say thank you in a perfectly calm voice, the voice she'd trained herself to use after so many years of taking calls whose contents could bring an entire life crashing down. She didn't sit. She walked straight into the bedroom, woke her daughter, and while helping the little girl into her clothes, she heard Winnie ask sleepily where they were going today. "Mommy," and June told her they were going to visit Grandma. "Do you remember Grandma? She's the woman who used to braid Mommy's hair when Mommy was your age." Into an old cloth bag with a broken strap that had been sewn back together with a different color of heavy thread, she packed 2 changes of clothes, a box of cookies, and the small plastic case containing Winnie's medicine, which she always kept in the outermost pocket, so she could reach it immediately. Phoenix Airport was already crowded at that hour, and when June pushed the bag toward the counter, she saw the expression on the employee's face, and knew everything had gone wrong before the woman even opened her mouth. The flight was full. There wasn't a single seat left. The employee said she was very sorry. "Ma'am, I can put you on tomorrow morning's flight and give you a meal voucher while you wait. That's the best I can do." June didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry either. There had been a time when she cried easily, but that time had passed long ago, and now when everything collapsed around her, the only thing left inside was a cold stillness that frightened even her. She placed both hands on the counter, rough hands with fingertips cracked from years of chemicals, and lowered her voice until the people waiting behind her couldn't hear. She said she understood. She wasn't blaming anyone, but there was a woman lying in Nashville waiting for her, and that woman had already spent June's entire childhood waiting for her. She said that when she'd been a child nobody wanted to take. No one had stepped forward and chosen her except that woman. She said, "Please don't make her wait one more night for me, because I'm not sure she has another night left to wait." The employee looked at June, then looked down. Winnie stood pressed against her mother's leg, one hand clutching the hem of June's gray sweater, looking up at the woman behind the counter with clear eyes that belonged to the father she'd never met. Something inside the woman's chest softened. She raised one finger and said, "Wait here for just a moment," then picked up the phone and turned away. June barely dared to breathe. She'd stopped depending on hope a long time ago, because hope was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. But she still stood there watching the woman's back, watching her nod, watching her put the receiver down and reach for the printer. "There are 2 seats at the very back," the employee said as she pushed 2 boarding passes across the counter. "I had to ask for them. Go quickly before they close the door." June took the 2 passes, and her hands began to shake. "Thank you. I'll remember this for the rest of my life. I mean that." She handed over the last credit card that still had room on it, and watched the card reader remain motionless for 2 seconds that felt as long as 2 years before it finally approved the charge. Then, she lifted her daughter into her arms, swung the cloth bag over her shoulder, and ran. On the way down the boarding bridge, Winnie's shoes squeaked against the floor, and the little girl asked, "Mommy, can I sit by the window? I want to look down at the clouds." June told her, "Of course, baby. The whole window is yours." As she stepped into the cabin, her eyes swept over the emergency exit signs above, and she counted the rows between their seats and the nearest door, an old habit so deeply rooted that she did it without even realizing she was doing it. Then she settled Winnie into the inside seat, fastened the little girl's seatbelt, and finally allowed her lungs to fill with one complete breath. Less than 100 steps from where June and her daughter were sitting, on the other side of the terminal, inside a private lounge that most passengers could go their entire lives without ever knowing existed, Rocco Belandi sat alone at the head of a table with an open file in front of him. He was reading the final pages of the Tennessee deal, something he'd spent nearly an entire year preparing, and was scheduled to sign in Nashville the following day. There was a knock at the door. The man who entered had salt and pepper hair, and had come from Memphis, wearing an expensive suit that had grown slightly too loose on his frame, and he began speaking from the doorway, speaking quickly, speaking too much, in the way people do when they know they will only be given one chance to talk. He explained the last quarter, the market, several canceled contracts, and how everything would recover if he were only given a few more months. Rocco didn't interrupt him once. He sat motionless with both hands resting on the table, the finger wearing a ring set with a black stone tapping once and then going still, and he allowed the other man to finish, allowed him to keep talking until his own voice finally ran dry, and the only sound left in the room was the air conditioning. Then Rocco turned one page in the file, rotated it, and pushed it across the table. The man lowered his eyes. On the page was a list of money that had been transferred out of his company during the very quarter he'd just described as disastrous, transferred to a name only his wife knew. His face went white. Rocco spoke in an even voice, no louder than someone asking what time it was. He said the money didn't bother him, that he'd already granted 2 extensions without charging a single dollar of interest, and each time he'd known exactly why he was doing it. He said what troubled him wasn't the number on the page. What troubled him was sitting there for 15 minutes, while a man who'd known him for 15 years assumed he didn't know. The man began to speak, his voice breaking, saying there had been a misunderstanding, saying he could explain. Rocco raised one hand, lifting it only several inches above the tabletop, and the other man fell silent, as though someone had covered his mouth. Rocco said that by Monday morning, your name will no longer appear on a single document at the port. There will be no letters, no lawsuit, no one calling you. You will simply no longer be there, and the people you usually have lunch with won't answer when you call, and in about a week you will understand. The man braced both hands against the edge of the table and asked, "What about the house?" His voice reduced to little more than breath. Rocco looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You keep the house." He said, "I know your daughter is in her final year. I know she's preparing for her exams, and I don't destroy a child for her father's mistake. That's my rule, not kindness, and don't confuse the two." Then he added one final sentence in that same calm voice, saying that if anyone asks why you lost everything, tell them the truth, because I will tell the truth, and I want your daughter to hear the story exactly as it happened, not some version you invent so you can still look her in the eyes. The man stood. He tried to say thank you, but no sound came out, and when he reached for his briefcase, his entire hand shook so badly that it took him 2 attempts to grasp the handle. The door closed behind him. Rocco pulled the file back into place and found the exact line he'd been reading before the interruption, as though the last 15 minutes had never happened. A little while later, someone carried in a tray of light food, placed it beside his elbow, and invited him to eat before boarding the plane. Rocco glanced at it once. He said, "Please take that away. It contains sesame. I can't eat it, and my medical records state that clearly." The attendant apologized repeatedly and carried the tray out. Rocco didn't look up. He turned to the next page, and beyond the glass, one airplane after another lifted from the runway into the morning sunlight. Around the middle of the flight, when the cabin lights had been dimmed and most of the plane had slipped into that hazy state between sleep and waking, Winnie drifted off with her cheek pressed against the window, and June sat motionless beside her daughter, her eyes closed while her mind was 3 states away in a hospice hallway. She heard it before she understood what it was. A sound coming from the front of the cabin. Not a cough, not people arguing, but a thin, wet wheeze the sound air makes when it has to force itself through an opening that is slowly closing. There are sounds the body recognizes before the mind does, and that sound traveled through 4 years of silence, reached something buried very deep inside June, and shook it awake. She opened her eyes. There were running footsteps, someone calling for a flight attendant, that particular sound a crowd makes when everyone knows something is going wrong, but no one wants to be the person who says it aloud. June was already on her feet before she realized she'd stood up. She leaned toward the flight attendant nearby and said quietly that her little girl was asleep. "Could you please keep an eye on her for a moment?" Then stepped into the aisle. People were crowding together, rising out of their seats, craning their necks, holding up phones, and she had to work her way past them one by one. The curtain separating the front cabin had been pulled aside. There, slumped across 2 leather seats, was the man in the charcoal suit she'd briefly noticed while boarding. His collar pulled open, both hands clawing at his throat, his face changing color in a way June had seen too many times ever to forget. 2 broad-shouldered men blocked the entrance. One held out an arm to stop her and told her to step back. "If you aren't involved, stay out of the way." June said, "I'm an emergency medical technician. Let me through." The old profession came out of her mouth dry and rusted, a name she hadn't been allowed to call herself for 4 years, and the 2 men didn't move. They weren't listening to her. They were waiting for an order, and at that exact moment, the man dying in the seat lifted one hand several inches from the armrest, raised 2 fingers, and gave the smallest motion to the side. The 2 men immediately stepped back. June froze for half a breath. She watched that hand fall toward the seat again, and understood that this man, even with his lungs barely taking in any air, was still giving orders, and she understood at the same time that she was stepping into a world she probably should have stayed far away from. She knelt anyway. One of the 2 men was already holding a second emergency injector, the needle aimed toward his employer's thigh, and June caught his wrist. She asked, "How long ago did you give him the first one?" The man stammered that it had been almost 2 minutes. June said, "Then that's long enough that we should have seen some response, and there hasn't been any, which means the problem isn't the dose, and if you put another one into him, the next thing we'll be treating is his heart instead of his airway." The man released his grip. June turned toward the flight attendant, clutching the medical kit in both trembling hands, and she spoke in a voice she hadn't heard from herself in years, a voice so calm that it seemed to create order around it. She said, "Open the kit, empty everything onto the seat, then pick up each vial and read the label out loud to me. Every word. Don't skip anything." The flight attendant obeyed. The names came one after another through a cabin that had gone completely silent, and when she reached the 4th one, June said, "Stop. Give me that one, and a syringe." She held the small glass vial in her hand, and for one brief moment, she thought about a stamped piece of paper saying these hands were no longer permitted to touch a patient. Then she pushed the thought away. She snapped the neck of the vial, inserted the needle, drew up the medication, turned the syringe upright, flicked it twice to bring the air bubbles to the top, and pushed them out. She leaned close to the man's face, laid her open palm against his cheek, and said, "Look at me. You have 10 seconds. Give me those 10 seconds." His eyelids, already beginning to roll upward, stopped, lowered again, found her eyes, and held there. She pulled the fabric of his trousers aside, found the right place, drove the needle into the outer part of his thigh, pressed the plunger down slowly and steadily, held it there, then withdrew it. Then came the hardest part in the world. She placed 2 fingers against his neck and waited, counting silently inside her head, never taking her eyes off his for a single second, until the chest beneath that suit jerked upward and the man tore his first breath back into his lungs. The second breath came more easily than the first, and by the third, it was almost a normal breath, and color began returning to the man's face the way daylight slowly returns after a long night. Someone behind them started clapping, then someone else joined in, and then the entire cabin broke into a long wave of applause that June didn't hear because she still had 2 fingers pressed against the pulse in his neck, and she was still counting. That was when his hand found her wrist and closed around it. The grip was weak, but it didn't let go. He tried to speak, and it took him 2 attempts before any sound came out. Only 2 words. Her name. June looked down at the hand holding her. She saw the black stone ring on his ring finger, the kind of thing a man usually didn't wear if it was only jewelry. She looked up and saw 3 men in dark suits, quietly forming a circle around the place where she knelt. No one touching her, no one speaking, but standing in the way of men trained to make sure no one came in and no one went out. One of them was speaking into a satellite phone in a very low voice, and June understood, later than she should have, exactly who she'd just saved. She eased her wrist out of his hand slowly, without pulling away. She told him to listen to this before he rested, that a reaction like this could come back a second time several hours later, and the second reaction was often worse than the first. So the moment they reached the ground, he needed to go straight to a hospital, not a hotel. She told him to make sure they knew he'd already been given an injection, where it had been given, and what time, and then she told him the exact time. Then she stood. There was only one thought in her mind, and it was colder than everything happening around her. If he stopped breathing after her hands had touched him, then everything people had said about her for the past 4 years would no longer be rumor. It would become true, and she wouldn't survive it a second time. The captain announced that the plane was diverting for an emergency landing, and by the time the wheels touched the runway in Little Rock, night had already fallen. All passengers were told to remain seated, while medical personnel boarded first. June didn't remain seated. She'd already unfastened Winnie's seatbelt, already slung the cloth bag over her shoulder, and the moment the door opened, she was the first person out, carrying her daughter against her chest, walking straight ahead without looking back even once. At the rental car counter inside the terminal, they told her there was only 1 car left, and the price was more than an entire week's wages. June pushed her credit card across the counter, prayed it would go through one more time, and it did. That night she drove across 2 states, with her daughter asleep in the back seat. The radio turned low, both hands on the steering wheel and her eyes fixed on the lane markings, heading toward a hospice hallway where someone was waiting for her. Her phone remained in airplane mode because the battery was only half full and she needed it for the final stretch of the drive. That same night, not far away, inside a bright white emergency room, Rocco Belandi pushed the oxygen mask away from his face, despite the doctor's objections, and the first person he called wasn't family, wasn't the board, but Margot Fenwick. In a voice scraped raw and hoarse, he told her there had been a woman on that flight, hair tied back, gray sweater, traveling with a little girl, and he wanted her found. Margot asked how he intended to thank her. He was silent for a while before saying he didn't know. All he knew was that there had been 200 people inside that airplane, and dozens of phones held up in the air, and the only person who stepped forward was someone who owed him nothing, didn't know who he was, and had nothing left to lose. He said, "I pay hundreds of people to keep me alive, and not one of them managed to do what she did for free. I want to know why. Find her, whatever it costs." By sunrise, a video recorded from a row behind them had spread everywhere. People were calling her the woman in the gray sweater, and the entire country had begun searching for a name no one knew. The sky over Nashville still hadn't begun to brighten when June pushed open the door to the last room at the end of the hallway and saw Ruth Vandermeer lying there, diminished until June almost didn't recognize the woman who had driven a school bus for most of her life and had once taken June and her daughter into her home during the hardest years they had ever known. But Ruth's eyes opened when the door moved, and they found June immediately, and they lit up in exactly the same way they used to when June was a 12-year-old girl stepping down from the school bus. Ruth said, "My girl came home." June walked to the bed, took that hand in hers, and the knot that had been locked inside her chest for the past 2 days finally began to loosen. Winnie climbed onto the edge of the bed, kissed Ruth on the forehead, and proudly told her that she'd gotten to sit by the window and had seen the clouds from above. Ruth smiled and told her, "Then you've done better than I ever did. I went my whole life without seeing the clouds from above." Then she told June, "Take the little one outside for a while, sweetheart. I want to talk to her mother." A nurse led Winnie into the hallway and promised to show her where they kept the stuffed animals in the waiting room, and the door closed behind them. Ruth said she'd heard the nurses talking since the night before. Something happened on the airplane, didn't it? June started to say it was nothing, Mom. But Ruth tightened her fingers around June's hand, and June told her. She told her everything. About the wheezing sound coming from the front of the cabin, about the 2 men blocking the aisle, about the little glass vial in her hand, about the 10 seconds she'd asked for, and the 10 seconds she'd been given. Ruth listened without blinking. When June finished, she lay quietly for a while, then said, "Listen to me. I'm only saying this once because I don't have enough strength to say it twice." She said they had taken June's license, taken her name and put it in the newspapers, forced her to spend years cleaning floors at night. But the woman who had just knelt down in that airplane aisle, they hadn't taken her. Do you understand? That woman was still whole. Ruth said she'd waited 4 years to hear that she was still there. She said, "Now don't let them take the rest of her too." June bent down, pressed her forehead against the back of Ruth's hand, and promised, though she had no idea how she was going to keep that promise. Ruth released one long breath, and her face softened, and the lines carved there by a difficult lifetime seemed to ease before June's eyes. She said she was tired now and wanted to rest for a little while. She passed away as morning came, as quietly as someone falling asleep after a very long day. June remained beside her for a long time, still holding her hand, until she felt the exact moment that hand stopped holding hers back. Out in the hallway, June knelt until she was level with her daughter and said, "Grandma is resting now, sweetheart. She isn't tired anymore." Winnie asked whether Grandma had heard her story about the clouds. June said, she did. It was the last story she heard, and she loved it. 4 people came to the funeral. The woman who had opened her home to nearly 20 children no one else wanted had 4 people standing there when she was laid to rest, and June stood in that cold morning and understood something she would carry for the rest of her life, that the system used good people until they were worn down, then forgot their names. Winnie placed a small bouquet of flowers down, stepped back, and waved goodbye to Ruth with the same little wave she used at the school gate every morning. After everyone else had gone, June sat on a stone bench beside the path and turned on her phone for the first time in 3 days. The screen kept vibrating for nearly a full minute. There were hundreds of missed calls from numbers she'd never seen before. Messages from newsrooms, from strangers, from people claiming to represent someone. She moved through all of them with a numbness she could barely feel through, until she stopped at an email written by someone named Margot Fenwick. The message was short and polite, and it carried 2 pieces of news. The first was that Mr. Belandi wanted to meet her wherever she chose, whenever she wanted, under whatever conditions she set, and that he had no intention of disturbing her if she refused. The second came in the final paragraph, and the writer said she was sincerely sorry to be the person delivering it. The airline had filed an incident report. The licensing board had reopened June's case, and this time they weren't considering extending her suspension. This time they were considering permanent revocation. June chose a modest diner on 12th Street, the kind of place with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that had been sitting on the burner a little too long, and she chose it because she wanted this meeting to happen somewhere she understood the rules. The black car pulled up outside close to noon, and when 2 broad-shouldered men entered first and took positions on either side of the door, the whole diner went silent, as though someone had pulled the plug from the wall. The waiter froze in the middle of the aisle with a coffee pot in his hand, and didn't dare take another step. Rocco Belandi came in last. He sat down across from June, and before he could say a word, she spoke. She told him to send those 2 men outside. Her daughter was eating, and she didn't want the child having breakfast beneath 2 shadows. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he made one small motion with his hand, and the 2 men went outside. The waiter let out a breath. Conversation slowly returned to the diner, and Winnie went back to cutting her piece of cake as though nothing had happened. Rocco said he hadn't come to thank her, because those words were too small for what he owed, and he hadn't come to ask why she'd walked away either, because that belonged to her. He said he'd come because there was one thing he hadn't told anyone. He said that when he was lying across those airplane seats and knew he had only a few seconds left, he hadn't thought about his company, hadn't thought about the port, hadn't thought about a single number. He'd thought about his own funeral. He said there would be a great many people there. He knew that for certain, people would wear dark clothes and stand in lines and say beautiful things about him. Then he stopped. He said, and not one of them would really cry. That was the thought he'd been ready to take with him, until a stranger placed her hand against his face and made him look into her eyes. June said nothing. He reached into his coat, and she had already prepared herself for a check, already prepared her answer. But what he placed on the table wasn't a check. It was a thin file. She opened it and found the complete record of her old case, including pages she'd never been allowed to see, and clipped to the top was the name of a certification restoration program for people who had left the profession and wanted to return. Rocco said he'd looked into it, and he knew he couldn't buy her dignity back for her. No one could buy that for another person. He said she'd have to go and reclaim it herself, one step at a time, and it would be very difficult, and there was a chance she wouldn't get it back at all. He said the only thing he could do was open the door. Whether she walked through it was up to her. June looked at the file for a long time. Then she said, "If I accept this, I have 3 conditions, and if you don't agree to all 3, I get up and walk out right now." She said the first condition was that not $1 of his money would touch her daughter's surgery. She would pay for that herself, even if it took longer. The second was that no one would arrange anything for her behind the scenes. If she took the exam, she would take it for real. If she failed, she would fail for real. She didn't want to reach the end of her life, still wondering whether she'd deserved what she had. Then she stopped and looked directly into his eyes. She said the third condition was that if anyone ever stood in her way and something happened to them afterward, if she heard even once that he'd used his own methods to clear the road for her, she would take her daughter and leave, and he would never find either of them again. Rocco was silent. He remained silent much longer than those first 3 seconds. Long enough for June to hear plates touching one another behind the kitchen counter. And in that silence something old and very heavy seemed to be weighing itself behind his eyes. Then he said, "Agreed. All 3. Winnie, who had been quietly eating until then, suddenly placed her small hand over the back of his, the hand wearing the black stone ring, and said, "Don't be sad anymore. Grandma Ruth said when your heart is sad, you have to find something to do. She said that's why she grew tomatoes." Rocco looked down at that tiny hand, and a man no one had dared interrupt for many years sat quietly and listened to the advice of a 4-year-old child. Then he said, "Thank you. I'll find something to do." Winnie had finished eating and was busy coloring on the paper liner beneath her tray when June took out her phone, opened a photograph, and turned the screen toward Rocco. She told him to look at it. It was a picture of the casing from the emergency injector one of his men had used on him aboard the plane, the one that hadn't worked at all, and June had picked it up from the cabin floor before walking out the door, without even understanding why she'd done it. She enlarged the faint line of printing along the edge of the casing. She said, "I need you to understand something. That medication didn't fail because it was old, and it didn't fail because of temperature. That injector had been diluted. Someone removed part of what was inside, replaced it with something that wasn't medication, then sealed it again and sold it as untouched product." Rocco looked at the photograph without speaking. June continued, and now her voice was different, lower and slower, like someone descending a staircase she'd spent years refusing to walk down. She said, "I know that line of printing because I've seen it once before, the night of March 14th, 4 years ago. At the time, she was still an emergency medical technician with an air rescue crew. They picked up a 22-year-old man suffering anaphylactic shock on the highway, and inside the helicopter, June followed every step exactly, so precisely that when people later reviewed the report, they couldn't find a single procedural mistake. She gave the first injection. Nothing happened. She gave the second. Still nothing. The young man died before they landed. People said she'd injected him in the wrong place. Said she'd been too slow. Said she'd panicked. June said there had been something wrong with the medication. No one believed her. The newspapers gave her a name she still couldn't bring herself to read again. And within 6 months, she lost her license, lost her profession, and lost even the right to call herself by the name of the work she'd once done. She set the phone on the table. "You see it now. The same medication, 4 years apart. Once it almost killed you. Once it killed that young man, and it killed my life with him." Rocco sat very still. Then he asked a question June hadn't expected. He asked whether she knew he had a signing scheduled in Nashville on the 15th. She said no. He said he was beginning to see something, and it wasn't pleasant. He said someone didn't want that signing to happen, because once he acquired that distribution company, all 4 years of its records would be opened and examined, line by line. Whoever did this hadn't intended to kill him. Killing him would create chaos, trigger investigations, throw the entire organization into turmoil. They only needed him in a hospital for a few days, long enough to delay the signing, and an allergic reaction to food would look exactly like an accident. He said changing one line in his medical file would be easy. All it takes is one person inside the system, and one afternoon. June asked, "Then what about the injector?" Rocco smiled, but it wasn't a smile. He said that was the part the man hadn't calculated. He had no idea what was inside the emergency kit on that airplane. Rocco said, "Do you understand? The product he's been selling for years traveled so far that it ended up right inside my own security team's emergency kit. He meant to make me sick for a few days. Then his own merchandise came back and nearly killed me." He said it very quietly, and in the middle of that noisy diner, June felt a chill move along her spine. Rocco took out his phone and dialed a number, and when the person on the other end answered, his voice changed completely. Nothing remained of the man who had just sat listening to advice from a little girl. He said, "Margot, I want every pharmaceutical distribution contract connected to the family from the last 4 years. Every one of them. Include the ones that were terminated." He listened for a moment, then said, "No, not through the office." Then he added one final sentence, speaking slowly. "And Silvio is not to know anything." The next morning, Margot placed 2 boxes of records on the floor of his office, thick and complete enough that for one brief moment, Rocco looked at them and thought no one could possibly have gathered this much in a single night. Then he opened the first box, and the thought disappeared. The family meeting took place Thursday night in the long dining room, where his father had sat for 20 years in the exact chair that now belonged to him. And when Rocco walked in, 9 people were already seated, 9 faces he'd known since before he was tall enough to see over the edge of the table. He announced briefly that the last branch of the business that had never been made legitimate would be cut away during this quarter, and that after that, the Belandi family would keep only the things that could be brought into the light without anyone having to lower their eyes. No one said anything. Then Silvio pushed back his chair and stood. He asked whether Rocco knew where this table came from. He said their grandfather had slept in a warehouse through 3 winters, sleeping on sacks, saving every dollar he could. And when he finally bought this house, the first thing he did was build this table with his own hands, because he wanted his children and grandchildren to have a proper place to sit and eat. He said Rocco's father had sat in the exact chair Rocco was sitting in now, and he'd died before 60, died because of this table, because of the sleepless nights, because of all the things he'd swallowed so everyone in this family could have food on their plates. He said, "And now you intend to sell all of that just to buy yourself one word, clean." Silvio never raised his voice, and that was what made the word so heavy. He said, "You think people are going to applaud you? They'll wait until you've put everything down, and then they'll walk right in." He looked around the table and said 30 families lived because of this house. 30 kitchens had food cooking because of this house. And Rocco was cutting away one branch after another, while no one dared ask what those people were supposed to live on afterward. Several people nodded. None of them nodded strongly, but they nodded, and Rocco saw everyone. He remained silent until Silvio sat down. Then he didn't argue a single point. He opened his briefcase, took out 3 photographs, and placed them on the table, sliding each one in a different direction. The room went still. He called 3 names, one at a time, without raising his voice or placing emphasis on a single word. He said, "The 3 of you have been taking money from a side I expressly forbade you to deal with, and you've been taking it for the entire past year, and you've sat at this table eating with me while you were doing it." None of the 3 men looked up. Rocco said, "Tomorrow morning, go see Margot and sign your resignation papers." Then he said the rest, and he said it slowly. He said, "You keep your houses, you keep your pensions, you keep your names. No one in this city will ever know what happened, and your children will keep going to school as if nothing changed." He stopped. Then he said, "My father wouldn't have allowed that, and every one of you knows exactly what he would have done. That is the entire difference between him and me, and I strongly suggest none of you try to find out how deep that difference goes." He stood before anyone could speak, gathered the 3 photographs, and said the cuts would proceed on schedule. Anyone who disagreed could come speak to him directly. He said, "Stop talking behind each other's backs. This family has done enough of that." When he reached the door, Silvio called after him in an almost familiar voice and said, "You're standing alone now, Rocco. Look at the table yourself and count how many people are still standing with you." Rocco stopped with one hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. "I already counted." Then he walked out. That night, he went home, took off his coat, sat down on the floor of his study beside the 2 boxes of records, and started reading from the first page. He read until close to dawn, and at some point, among the steady stream of distribution contracts and familiar signatures, he stopped at the name of a company he'd never heard of before. A company registered somewhere far away, appearing again and again like a thread running through 4 years of paperwork. He picked up a pen and circled it. Then he sat there for a very long time, staring at that ring of ink, and he knew that what he was holding in his hands was no longer about business. On her first morning at the training center, June sat in her car in the parking lot longer than she'd intended, watching people pass beyond the windshield, most of them younger than she was, all of them looking as though they knew exactly where they were going, and she nearly put the car into reverse. In the end, she went inside. The man in charge was an older instructor named Walt Kimura, with gray hair and a rough voice, and he began by saying that most of you sitting in this room won't make it all the way through this program, not because you aren't smart enough, but because coming back is harder than starting. People who are new don't know what they're missing. You know exactly what you've lost, and that empty place will eat at you a little more every day. The first simulation took place that same morning, and Walt called June up first. She walked to the wired mannequin, and for the first 30 seconds, everything was right. Her hands knew where to go without needing her to think. Then she named a medication and stated the dose, and a very young trainee in the back row quietly said, "They changed that, ma'am, 2 years ago." The whole room went silent. June stood there with the wrong syringe in her hand, her face burning, and for one brief moment, she was back inside a meeting 4 years earlier, where people had taken turns saying she wasn't capable enough to do the work. She opened her mouth to apologize. Walt cut her off. "Don't apologize, correct it. What's the current protocol?" June straightened and said, "I don't know." She said it clearly, without trying to hide behind anything, without blaming the 4 years she'd been away. "I don't know the current protocol." Walt nodded, and what he did next caught her completely off guard. He smiled. "Good. That's the sentence I was hoping more than anything to hear in this room this morning." He turned toward the class and said, "Do you know how many people die every year because somewhere in the room there's one person who doesn't have the courage to say those 3 words? I don't know. I'm not giving you a number. Go work long enough, and you'll find out for yourselves." He said the empty space he'd talked about earlier wasn't a weakness. It was a place where new knowledge could go, and the person who could identify the gaps in what they knew was the person who could fill them. Then he turned toward the young trainee and said, "Thank you. You just taught someone with 10 more years of experience than you. Go home and write down today's date." In the weeks that followed, June lived according to a rhythm she didn't know how long she could sustain. She studied late into the night at the kitchen table after Winnie had gone to sleep. Studied until the words on the page began to blur, then woke before dawn to make breakfast for her daughter, and braid the hair she still never seemed to braid quite right. One evening, after a particularly terrible day, she sat looking at the business card Rocco had left her, the one with nothing but a handwritten number on the back. And she called. She didn't call because she needed anything. She called just to see whether anyone would answer. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "I embarrassed myself in front of the entire class. A kid who isn't even as old as my younger brother had to correct me." He asked whether she'd learned the right protocol. She said yes. He said, "Then that kid just made you better than the woman you were this morning, and someday someone may stay alive because of it. Don't call that embarrassment." Then he asked how Winnie was doing and whether she'd gotten used to her new school. After that, it became a habit. Every week he asked, and what surprised June wasn't that he asked, but that he remembered. He remembered the name of Winnie's teacher. He remembered that she was afraid of the neighbor's dogs. Once, Winnie snatched the phone from her mother's hand to announce that her doll Pepper had torn an arm and Mommy had sewn it back on, and the following week, the first thing Rocco asked when June answered was whether Pepper's arm had healed. June stood in the kitchen holding the phone, staring out into the darkness beyond the window, and realized that the man an entire city only dared speak about in whispers was carrying the name of a cloth doll somewhere inside his memory, and she had no idea what to do with that thought. One Friday afternoon, after everyone else in the class had gone home and June was putting away her things in the practice room, Walt Kimura stood in the doorway and asked whether she could sit down for a moment because there was something he needed to tell her, something he'd been meaning to say since the first day she walked through that door. He pulled a chair over and sat across from her, both hands resting on his thighs, and he didn't look at her. He asked whether she'd ever wondered who signed the report that caused her license to be taken away. June said the name had been blacked out in the copy she was given. Walt nodded very slowly. He said, "It was me." The air conditioner hummed steadily in the room, and somewhere outside, someone was pulling down a metal shutter, and June sat there listening to those sounds, while her entire world seemed to turn once around her. He said, "My son was the warehouse manager for a small contractor. That night, he was the one who signed for the shipment. He signed without opening it to inspect anything, because he'd been signing deliveries that way for 2 years, and nothing had ever gone wrong. When everything fell apart, people came to see me. They told me there were 2 ways this could end. The first was to trace the failure back through the warehouse, and if they did that, my son would have to stand trial under a charge he'd carry for the rest of his life. The second was for the official report to conclude that the medical worker aboard the helicopter had performed the procedure incorrectly, and they needed the signature of someone with standing in the profession to make that conclusion hold." He said, "I was that person. I was also the one who recommended you for the flight team when you were 23. You remember that, don't you? I sat on that board and told them you were the person I trusted most in your class." His voice broke in the middle of the sentence. He said, "I sat in my car for almost 2 hours before I signed it. I kept telling myself you were young, barely into your 20s, that you'd find another job, get married, build another life, while my son would never be able to stand again if they stamped that mark onto his name. I told myself that so many times that eventually I believed it. Then I signed." For the first time, he looked up at her. He said, "Recently, I was taking an overnight bus to visit my sister. The bus stopped at the station close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was sitting on a bench in the waiting area when I saw a woman pushing a cleaning cart past me. I recognized you immediately. You never saw me. I sat there and watched you clean that entire terminal, then watched you push the cart away until you disappeared. And I understood that what I'd told myself in that car years earlier had been a lie, and I'd lived inside that lie for 4 years." He said, "I thought about quitting. Then I realized that if I walked away, it still wouldn't give you anything back. So I stayed here and taught. I kept teaching. And every time someone walks into this classroom trying to begin again, I think of you." He said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I only wanted you to know the truth because you have the right to know it, and because I didn't want you to finish this entire program only to hear it later from someone else's mouth." June sat in silence for a very long time. She thought of a woman lying in a hospital bed telling her not to let them take the rest of her. She thought of her daughter sitting at daycare waiting for her mother to come pick her up. Then she spoke in a voice so calm that even she was surprised by it. She said, "You took 4 years from me, and I'm not going to tell you that was all right, because it wasn't. It mattered. It mattered more than you know." Then she said, "But I'm raising a child by myself, and I have to work, and I have to study, and I have to get up before sunrise. There isn't enough room inside me to carry hatred for you and carry my daughter at the same time. If I have to choose, I choose my daughter." She said, "So I forgive you, not because you deserve it, because I need that space for something else." Walt lowered his head and began to cry. The quiet kind of crying that comes from an old man who has carried something for far too long. And June stood, rested one hand on his shoulder for a moment, then picked up her bag and walked outside to get her daughter. The man leaning against the door of June's car in the training center parking lot that afternoon had eyes exactly like Rocco's, only colder, and he greeted her by name as though they'd known each other for years. He said, "I'm Silvio Belandi. I'm his cousin, and I didn't come here to threaten you, so don't look at me like that." He didn't reach inside his coat, didn't lower his voice, didn't step 1 inch closer. He only held out a thin packet of papers. June opened it and saw a foreclosure notice for Ruth's house in Nashville, followed by a statement of debt, the numbers she hadn't known existed, arranged in neat rows beneath the name she loved more than any other in the world. Silvio said, "I didn't create those papers. Call the bank and ask. Anyone can verify them in 20 minutes. I only brought them to you sooner." He said he knew her daughter was waiting for surgery, and he knew June was waiting for money. Then he said what he'd come to say. He asked what she was getting by staying here. He said, "You make my cousin feel better about himself. That's all. 6 months from now, when that sense of debt inside him cools down, you'll still be a woman cleaning floors at night, with a child waiting for surgery, and a house being taken by the bank." He asked whether she wanted to help her little girl or help Rocco Belandi's conscience. June held the papers for a long time. She stood there in the parking lot, with the wind moving between the rows of cars, reread the line showing the date the bank would take possession of the house, and thought about the porch where Ruth used to sit shelling beans. Then she folded the papers, held them back toward him, and said, "Keep them. I'll ask the bank myself." He took them, nodded as though he'd expected that answer, and said, "Think about it. I'm in no hurry." June drove away with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt, and she didn't go home. She drove straight to Rocco's residence in Chicago, having relocated her training and Winnie's medical care to the city because she needed to tell someone what had just happened, and because she realized, with a small amount of fear, that the person she needed to tell was him. The door opened, he led her into his study, and before she could speak, her eyes stopped on the desk. There was a typed sheet of paper lying there. Silvio's name was on the first line. Beneath it were his home address, his office address, the time he left home in the morning, the restaurant where he usually ate lunch, and the name of his driver. June looked at the paper, then at Rocco. "You already knew," Rocco said. "Since noon." She asked, "Since noon means almost 6 hours ago, and you've been sitting here for 6 hours with that paper on your desk?" He said yes. She asked why he hadn't done anything. Rocco looked at the page for a moment. Then he said, "Because in that diner, you made me promise." He said that all his life, every promise he'd ever kept had benefited him somehow. If you kept your word, people trusted you. If people trusted you, business got done. It was an investment, not morality. He said, "This is the first promise I've ever kept where keeping it gives me nothing at all except 6 hours of sitting still and staring at a piece of paper." Then he said, "And I'll tell you the truth. I picked up the phone twice." June asked what stopped him. He said there was something else. He said, "There was a man in Memphis I once took everything from. I let him keep his house because his daughter was in her final year of school. My family has a rule, my rule really, that we don't touch the families of our enemies." He said he'd managed to keep that rule for decades because he'd never truly cared about anyone. "Now I do care. And if I call the number on this page, I'll be the first person to break my own rule. And the thing I drag you into will become exactly the thing you're trying to walk away from." June said, "I thought you'd be angry." He said, "I am angry, but you were right to make me promise, and I owe you my life, so I'm listening to you." June sat down in the chair across from him, and for the first time since she'd walked off that airplane, she felt her shoulders lower a little. She told him everything that had happened in the parking lot, including Silvio's final question, and Rocco listened without interrupting once. When she left, he walked her all the way to the door. Then he went back inside, picked up the paper, read it one more time, and burned it in the stone ashtray on his desk, standing there until nothing remained but ash. Silvio sent it through the mail, a plain white envelope with no return name, and it arrived in June's mailbox on a rainy afternoon. Inside was only one photocopied page and a small note with a few words written on it. "Ask him whose signature this is." The page was a distribution authorization, clearly listing the receiving company, clearly showing the date, and that date was March 14th, 4 years earlier. In the lower right corner, written in firm, unmistakable ink, was Rocco Belandi's signature. June stood in the kitchen holding the paper and stopped hearing the rain. She drove through that afternoon storm and reached his house after dark, and when he opened the door, she didn't step inside. She stood in the yard with water running through her hair and held up the page. She said, "Explain this to me." Rocco looked at the paper in her hand, and he didn't look surprised, and that lack of surprise told her everything she needed to know. He said, "Come inside first, you're soaked." She said, "How long have you known?" He was silent for one beat. Then he said, 3 weeks. June heard herself laugh, a short, ugly sound she'd never heard come out of her before. She said, 3 weeks. So you already knew before the day you called me to ask how my daughter was doing. She said, "You sat across from me in that diner. You pushed that file across the table. You told me you couldn't buy my dignity back for me. You looked straight into my eyes and said that." She said, "Do you know what I thought in that moment? I thought you were the first person in 4 years who looked at me without seeing the headline." Rocco said, "I didn't know at the diner. I found out afterward." June said, "Then what were these past 3 weeks? 3 weeks of calling to ask about my daughter's doll. 3 weeks of listening to me talk about class. 3 weeks of sitting still with a piece of paper on your desk because you were keeping a promise to me and making me believe you were a different kind of man, she said. What was all of that? Answer me. Then she said the sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. I am not the machine you use to wash your conscience clean. He stood beneath the light of the doorway, while rain blew across the steps, and he didn't deny a single word. He said, Everything you said is true. She said, I know it's true. I don't need you to confirm it. He said, I signed that paper during the second week after my father died. There were hundreds of documents waiting for my signature, and I signed all of them in 3 days. I signed this one in the middle of the others. I didn't read it. He said, I'm not telling you that as an excuse, because it doesn't excuse anything. I signed it. That night, what went onto your helicopter passed through a document carrying my signature. That is the truth, and it isn't going to change. June said, Then why did you hide it from me? Rocco was silent longer than necessary. Then he said, Because I know you. He said, If I'd handed you this paper 3 weeks ago, you would have walked away that same night. You would have left the program, left the exam, left all of it, and you would have gone back to that bus terminal and cleaned floors at night until your back gave out. He said, I didn't hide it because I was afraid you'd hate me. I knew sooner or later you'd find out, and I knew you'd hate me then. I hid it because I wanted you to have your license in your hands first. He said, I'd rather have you hate me for the rest of your life than watch you lose one more night to that floor. June stood motionless in the rain. She said, You're doing exactly what you've done your whole life. You sit at the head of the table, decide what is good for me, hide the rest, and call it protection. She said, You don't have the right to decide for me, even if you're right. She said, For 4 years, people have taken everything from me. The only thing I had left was the right to know what was happening to my own life, and you just took that too. Rocco said nothing after that. He couldn't find a single sentence to answer with, and he knew there wasn't one. June folded the paper, slipped it into her coat pocket, and turned toward her car. He called her name once. She didn't stop. She drove away through the rain, and for the next 3 weeks she didn't answer his calls, didn't respond to his messages, and he didn't call a second time. The letter from the bank arrived during the 3rd week, and it said June had 10 days to remove everything from the house in Nashville. She read that line again and again without being able to understand it. Ruth had paid that house off a long time ago. She'd told the story many times, told it every Christmas in the voice of someone who had defeated something enormous in her life. How she'd made the final payment on a September morning and then stood in the middle of the yard and cried. So why was the house being taken now? June called the bank, and all they would say was that they were sorry. The account was under review, and she should come to the branch if she had questions. She arranged for Winnie to stay at daycare for 2 days, booked a quick flight to Nashville, and opened the door to that house for the first time since the funeral. Everything inside was still exactly as it had been on the day Ruth went to the hospice. There was a cup turned upside down on the dish rack. There was a calendar page that had never been torn away. June started in the living room, putting the things she would keep into boxes and the things she would give away into bags, working mechanically so she wouldn't have to think. By afternoon, she reached the bedroom. She pulled several shoe boxes from beneath the bed, then her hand touched something heavier, a square holiday cookie tin with rust along 2 corners. She pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, an entire box filled with letters. The envelopes were standing upright, packed tightly together, and every one carried a red stamp saying it had been returned to sender. She picked up the one on top, turned it over, and read the address written in the slanted handwriting she'd seen on hundreds of birthday cards throughout her life. To the Arizona Emergency Medical Licensing Board. June sank down onto the floor. She took them all out, arranged them in stacks across the rug, and counted. 142 letters. That old woman had written 3 letters every month, steadily, for 4 years, to an agency where she didn't know a single person, about a process she didn't understand, using an old typewriter in the corner of the living room and stamps she bought at the post office down the street, and not one letter had ever been opened. They stamped them and sent them back, one after another, year after year, and still she kept writing. June opened the first letter, dated 4 years earlier. Only a few weeks after the newspapers had given her the name, she still couldn't bring herself to read again. In it, Ruth introduced herself as a retired school bus driver and wrote that she didn't understand their rules, but she understood this girl, and she was asking them to please read the file one more time. June opened the next letter. then the next. The handwriting leaned farther with each passing year, the strokes becoming shakier, but the words remained the same, still polite, still patient, still asking them to please look at the file one more time. She read until she reached the final letter, then looked at the date and realized Ruth had written it only a few weeks before entering the hospice. The writing was larger and more uneven, done by hand instead of on the typewriter, perhaps because by then she could no longer sit upright for very long. Ruth wrote that this was my 142nd letter. She wrote that, "I imagine you won't open this one either, and I don't blame you. You're probably very busy." She wrote that, "But if someday someone does open it, please know one thing. That girl has never ruined anything in her life. She simply never had anyone standing on her side. I have stood on her side ever since the day she was 12 years old and stepped down from my school bus. The trouble is that I don't have any power, ladies and gentlemen. All I have is paper and stamps." June sat on the floor among those letters until the house had gone completely dark, and she never turned on a light. She cried the way people cry when there is no one else left in the house to be careful around. Cried for an old woman sitting at a typewriter in an empty living room 3 times every month for 4 years. Cried because through all that endless time, June had believed she was completely alone. It was late before she finally began placing the letters back inside the tin. And when she reached the bottom layer, she found another envelope, thicker than the others, bearing the markings of a bank. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, assumed it was some old bill Ruth had saved out of habit, and placed it back inside the box without opening it. Then she closed the lid, carried the tin out to her rental car, and sat behind the steering wheel for a very long time without moving. 2 days later, after flying back, she arrived at the training center before Walt Kimura. Margot Fenwick called June on a Tuesday evening and said, "I know you don't want to hear anything from our side right now, but there's something I think you need to be the first person to see." She said they'd found the original warehouse intake log from that night, the handwritten book rather than the computerized record, and there was a receiving signature in it. June asked whose signature. Margot was silent for half a second, then said, "I think you should see it for yourself." She sent a photograph of the page to June's phone, and June opened it beneath the kitchen light, and there, in the final column, written in the right-leaning handwriting she'd looked at for 6 years on notes stuck to the refrigerator, were 2 words. Caleb Hollis. She placed the phone on the table. For the next 2 minutes, June Hollis sat motionless in her kitchen, while her entire world tilted sideways. Her husband, the man she'd buried while she was pregnant with the child they hadn't even had time to name together. He had signed for that shipment. He'd been there, somewhere inside that chain. His hands were in it. She thought about the nights he'd come home late, the phone calls he'd stepped onto the porch to take. And in those 2 brief minutes, she began building a story she didn't want to build. Then Margot called again. She said, "Are you still there?" I wasn't finished. She asked whether June knew what her husband had been responsible for at the station besides being a firefighter. June said he inspected equipment. Margot said, "Exactly. He was responsible for inspecting and rotating the station's medical equipment. And that night he signed for the shipment because that was his job. He signed for the entire station." Then she said there was something else, and this part, she thought June should sit down for. She said that in the same logbook, 3 weeks before that night, there was a note written into the margin in the same handwriting, and she was going to read it exactly as it appeared. She read slowly. "This batch seems more diluted than usual. Looks different from previous shipments. Separated 2 boxes. Need to send samples for testing before use. We'll follow up with contractor on Monday." June couldn't speak. Margot said, "He saw it. 3 weeks before everything happened, he held that product in his hands, knew something wasn't right, and wrote it down." She said they'd checked, and no samples were ever sent. Then she stopped, and neither woman had to say the thing lying between them, that Monday never came, because the spring fire that year happened first. June remained sitting for a long time after the call ended. Then she stood, went into the storage room, and pulled down a dust-covered cardboard box from the top of the closet. It was the box of personal belongings the fire station had returned to her 4 years earlier. The box she'd accepted with both hands at the door, carried straight to the top shelf, and never once found the courage to open. She sat down on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside was a wristwatch, a badge, several photographs, a pair of gloves, and at the bottom, lying flat, was a hard-covered notebook with curled edges. She turned the pages one by one. Work notes, dates, times, numbers. the hurried handwriting of a man recording things while he worked. Then she reached that exact page. The note in the margin, written in blue ink, smaller than everything around it, as though he'd written it for himself so he wouldn't forget. She read it with her own eyes, not through someone else's voice. June pressed the notebook against her chest and sat on the floor among her husband's belongings, and she cried in a way completely different from the night in Nashville. That night she'd cried because someone had stood on her side. Tonight she cried because for 4 years she'd stood alone in front of everyone and said there was something wrong with the medication, and not one person had believed her. And it turned out there had been someone who believed it. Someone who believed it before she ever needed him to, only he hadn't lived long enough to tell anyone. She stayed there until nearly morning, one hand resting on the page bearing his handwriting, and whispered into the empty room, "You found it. You found it before I did." The next morning, she wrapped the notebook inside a paper bag, picked up her phone, and for the first time in 3 weeks, dialed the handwritten number on the back of the business card. The call reached Rocco close to 4 o'clock in the morning, and the man bringing the news was an old driver at the port, a man who had driven for Rocco's father since before Rocco could walk. He said, "Sir, they called the whole crew into Warehouse 3. They told us to clear it out tonight. Load all the records onto the trucks. Something about this doesn't feel right, so I called you." Rocco said, "Thank you. Stay exactly where you are. Don't do anything." He called Margot on the way to the port and said only one thing, "Warehouse 3. Right now." Then ended the call. When his car stopped at gate number 4, 3 trucks were already running inside, all their headlights on, white beams cutting across the concrete yard, while people loaded boxes of records into the back of the last truck. The man with Rocco opened his door, stepped out, and instinctively reached inside his coat. Rocco caught his wrist. "Put your hand down," the man said. "But sir," Rocco said, "there are cameras here, and tonight I need that footage clean from beginning to end. Clean enough that they can play it in court and I can sit there without moving. Do you understand me?" The man lowered his hand. Then Rocco took off his coat, handed it to him, and walked into the yard alone, both hands empty, straight into the glare of the headlights, and stopped directly in front of the first truck. The engine growled and kept running. He didn't shout. He only raised his voice enough to carry over the motors. He said, "I'm not going inside that warehouse, and no one else is going inside either. Everything stays exactly where it is." He said, "I'm only standing here. Anything that wants to leave through this gate has to go through me." The driver in the cab remained still, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his face washed pale by the dashboard lights. Rocco said, "I know you men. Mr. Ellis drove for my father when I was still in school. Mr. Ferrara has hauled freight for this family for 30 years, he said. "And I know you're waiting for me to give an order, because you've spent your whole lives working here, and your job has always been to wait for someone to tell you what to do." He paused. Then he said, "Tonight I'm asking you to do something I've never asked anyone in this family to do. Don't follow orders. Don't even follow mine. Think for yourselves." He said, "What's inside those boxes is the paper trail for diluted emergency medication, product that has been sold all over the country for years, and it has ended up inside medical kits in places none of you would ever imagine." He said, "Mr. Ferrara, your granddaughter has asthma. You told me about it last year. If one night she has an attack at school and someone runs for the emergency kit, what do you want to be inside that box?" No one spoke. There was only the sound of 3 engines idling. Then the first truck shut off. Part of the roar disappeared, and inside the silence that opened around it, the second truck shut down too. Then the third. The headlights went dark one by one, and the yard returned to the weak yellow glow of the overhead lamps, while the men climbed out of their trucks and stood beside them. No one went anywhere. Federal vehicles entered through gate number 4 exactly 10 minutes later, and they moved quickly, cleanly, with the precision of people who already knew which direction to take inside this port. Rocco watched them seal the warehouse doors. Then he turned toward Margot Fennick, who had just come to stand beside him, and said, "I called exactly one person tonight." She didn't answer. He said, "And those boxes of records you brought me after one night, I remember thinking that was too fast. I let it go." Margot kept her eyes on the yard. She said, "I've been here for more than a year." She said, "I was sent here to wait for you to make a mistake, and I've waited for more than 12 months, and you haven't made one. You just keep cutting things away. then cutting again. She said, "I reported upstairs that you were the first man in 30 years who was trying to walk out of this through the front door, and no one believed me." Then she turned toward him. She said, "Now you have two roads." She said, "The first is that you stay silent. Your lawyer is good. That signature is one signature among hundreds of documents. You can get out from under it. But if you choose that road, then everything in this warehouse becomes evidence in an active investigation. It gets sealed, and no one is allowed to touch it for years. Which means Miss Hollis will never be able to prove what she's been saying. Her license will be taken permanently." She said, "The second road is that you testify. You tell them everything. You open all of it, and she gets her name back. Then she said the rest, very quietly, and you go to prison." The call from the hospital came the afternoon before the hearing was scheduled to begin, and the doctor spoke in the gentle voice June had learned to recognize, saying that lately the little girl had been tiring more quickly than usual, that this week's test results weren't what they had hoped for, and that in the opinion of the entire team, they shouldn't wait any longer. He said, "We have an opening in the surgical schedule tomorrow morning, and I recommend that you take it." June stood in the hospital hallway, with her coat still in one hand, and said, "Yes, tomorrow morning, we'll take it." Then she ended the call and remained there for a while because she knew exactly what tomorrow morning was. The hearing had been scheduled for weeks. The records had already been submitted. The board had set aside the time, and they had made it very clear that this was the final time her case would be reviewed. If it was postponed, the file would be closed and wouldn't be opened again. She called the program attorney, the young woman who had been working beside her for months, and said, "I can't be there." There was silence on the other end for several seconds before the woman asked whether she was certain, whether she understood what they were going to lose. June said, "I understand." She said, "I understand very clearly, but my daughter goes into surgery at 7 o'clock, and I will be there when they take her in, and I will be there when they bring her back, and if I have to choose, I don't need even 1 second to decide." She remained in the Chicago hospital hallway until nearly midnight, writing her request to the Arizona board to have the matter heard in her absence by hand, writing it 3 times until the words were concise enough, then signing the authorization, photographing it, and sending it before the sky began to lighten. In the message, she wrote only 1 sentence, explaining why, that her daughter was having surgery in Chicago that same morning, and she hoped the board would understand. That evening, mother and daughter were together in a hospital room with a reclining chair beside the bed, and June spread her coat across the chair, took off her shoes, then climbed onto the bed and lay down beside Winnie. Winnie wanted her to read the story about the rabbit who got lost in the forest, the book they had read so many times that the cover had gone soft and worn. June read, and when she reached the part where the rabbit found his way home, Winnie interrupted and said, "Mommy, you're reading it wrong. The rabbit has to ask the owl first." June said, "You're right. Mommy forgot. You read that part for me." Winnie recited the whole passage from memory, got a few words wrong, and giggled at herself. Then she lay quietly for a while, still holding her mother's thumb the way she had since she was very small, and asked whether Mommy was scared about tomorrow. June thought about the room in Arizona, where people would be talking about her the next day, while she wasn't there, thought about the door her daughter would be pushed through in the morning, and decided not to lie. She said, "Yes, Mommy is scared." Winnie thought for a moment in the solemn way 4-year-old children sometimes do, then said, "Then just stay still, Mommy. Don't run," she said. "Grandma Ruth told me that. She said when you're scared, stay still. If you run, you'll fall." June lay there for a very long time after hearing that. Then she said, "All right, Mommy will stay still." She told Winnie about Ruth, about how Ruth had driven a school bus and knew the name of every child who rode with her, about how she grew tomatoes on the porch, and every season gave more of them to the neighbors than she kept for herself, and Winnie fell asleep somewhere in the middle of the story. June lay in the darkness, listening to the steady sound of the equipment and the footsteps in the hallway outside. And she thought about the past 4 years, thought about the nights she'd pushed a cleaning cart across the empty bus terminal, thought about a tin box filled with letters that had all been returned, and she understood that tomorrow people would decide what happened to her life in Arizona, a place several states away, while there was nothing she could do about it. Near dawn, her phone vibrated once. It was Rocco. He had sent only 1 line, saying he knew what was happening tomorrow morning, that she shouldn't worry about what was happening in Arizona, and that she should stay with her little girl. June read the message twice, then placed the phone face down. At 6:45, they came to wheel Winnie's bed away. June walked beside it with one hand resting on the rail until they reached the door she wasn't allowed to pass through. She bent down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and said, "Mommy will be right here waiting. Remember that. Right here." Winnie lifted one hand and waved, the same little wave she used at the school gate every morning, and then the door closed. June sat down on the row of plastic chairs outside the operating room, placed both hands on her thighs, and stayed still, exactly the way her little girl had told her. In Arizona, the hearing room opened at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the public seating was nearly full because the video from the airplane still hadn't faded from people's memory. The chair reserved for the petitioner was empty. The presiding officer read June's request to have the matter heard in her absence, including the handwritten reason she'd given, and an attorney for the airline immediately stood and asked that the case be closed, saying that if the petitioner wasn't present, there was nothing further to consider. That was when a woman stood up from the very last row. She said, "My name is Rhonda Lindquist. I am the mother of the young man who died on that emergency flight that night, and I am asking this board not to close this case." The entire room turned toward her. She said, "For the past 4 years, I have been the person going everywhere, saying she was responsible. I wrote letters. I gave interviews. I did everything a mother who lost her son could do." She said, "Now I am standing here asking you to keep this case open, and I hope you understand that I am not saying those words lightly." The presiding officer looked at her for a moment, then asked her to sit down and said the board would continue. The next person called forward was a man no one in that room expected to see. Rocco Belandi entered with 3 federal attorneys, asked to be sworn in, and took the oath. He testified in the same calm voice he used for everything, never raising it once. He stated who he was, what his family was, and what kind of work he did. He testified that during the 2nd week after his father's death, he'd signed a distribution authorization he hadn't read, and that on the night of March 14th, the product that reached that emergency helicopter had passed through a document bearing his signature. He testified that it hadn't been an accident, that the medication had been systematically diluted for years, and that he'd turned over the entire record to federal authorities, including the pages carrying his own name. Then he came to the final part, and as he spoke, he turned toward the public seating. He said, "A few months ago, I stopped breathing on an airplane, and the person who came forward was a woman whose records say her hands were no longer allowed to touch a patient." He said, "She knew that. She knelt down anyway." He said, "I am not standing here today to ask you to show her mercy. I am standing here to tell you that my family is the reason 4 years of her life were taken from her, and you made her pay that price for us." The next person was Walt Kimura. He stood and said, "I was the man who signed the report that year," and then he told them why he'd signed it, leaving out nothing, including the part about his son. Halfway through, his voice broke and he had to stop to drink some water. He said, "I have taught this profession for nearly 40 years, and I still tell my students that the most dangerous person in an emergency room is the one who cannot say the 3 words, 'I don't know.'" Then he said, "But I did know. I knew, and I signed anyway." After that, June's attorney asked permission to submit a document that hadn't been part of the original case file. She said, "This is a letter from Ruth Vandermeer, the woman who raised my client from the age of 12, and over 4 years, she sent this board 142 letters. Every one of them was returned unopened." She said, "I would like to read the last one." Then she read it slowly, and there was no sound left in the room except her voice. When she reached the sentence where the old woman had written, "That girl has never ruined anything in her life. She simply never had anyone standing on her side," one member of the board removed his glasses and raised a hand to his face. When she read the final line, "I don't have any power, ladies and gentlemen. All I have is paper and stamps." Rhonda Lindquist stood for the 2nd time. She walked down the center aisle, trembling, and stood in the open space before the board, facing the empty chair reserved for June. She said, "I know she isn't here. I still need to say this." She said, "I hated you for 4 years. I prayed that you would never be allowed to do that work again. I said things that I am ashamed even to repeat now." Then she asked the question everyone in that room would remember for a very long time. She asked, "Can you forgive me?" No one answered her, because the only person who had the right to answer was sitting on a row of plastic chairs several states away. The presiding officer struck the gavel, suspended the hearing, ordered the entire case referred for reinvestigation, and said the final determination would be sent to the petitioner in writing. Silvio Belandi was arrested that afternoon in his own office, and he didn't deny a single thing. He stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, held out both hands, and while they went through the procedure, he looked at Rocco standing at the far end of the room and smiled. He said, "You think I came up with that?" He said, "You're more naive than I thought, Rocco. That operation existed before I was ever allowed a seat at the table. I only inherited it, and I kept it running because it was the only thing left that could still feed the dozens of families in this house after you cut everything else away." He said, "Go ask your father." "Oh, that's right. You can't ask him anymore." There was only the sound of the handcuffs locking shut. Then they led him away, and no one said anything else. That night, Rocco remained alone with the 2 boxes of records and began tracing everything backward. He worked his way through the years, through company names that changed again and again, through renewal contracts following one another with the steady rhythm of breathing, and he found the thing he had wanted to find while praying he never would. The thread began during his father's time. His father had built the operation himself, cleanly, carefully, hidden among legitimate businesses, and it had run quietly for years. Then his father died, and during the first week, Rocco sat in that chair, among hundreds of documents waiting for signatures. A 30-year-old man who had just buried his father signed a renewal without reading it, on the same afternoon, with the same pen, in the same stack as dozens of harmless papers. Rocco sat motionless for a very long time with that page in his hands. For months, he'd been searching for the person who had destroyed June Hollis's life. He'd reconstructed every night, every shipment, every signature. And now he knew. That person hadn't been hiding anywhere. That person had been sitting in his own chair for 4 years, signing papers without reading them and believing he was cleaning up the family. 3 days later, he went to headquarters for the last time before surrendering himself. Several people were still sitting in the long dining room, and when he passed through, they all stood at once, following a habit the family had carried through 3 generations, a habit no one could even remember beginning. Rocco stopped. He looked at each of them. Then he said, "Starting today, don't stand anymore." He said, "No one in this family will ever have to stand because someone walks into a room. No one here is greater than anyone else." He said, "You do business with papers you have actually read. Read every line. Read the pages people tell you to sign quickly." He said, "Go home and eat dinner with your wives and your children, and make sure you can sleep at night." He said, "That is everything I leave behind. Other than that, I leave you nothing." Then he walked toward the door, and not one person sat down. At the same time, several states away, June Hollis was sitting on the row of plastic chairs outside the surgical unit, in the exact place where she'd been since 7 o'clock that morning, when the doctor came out, lowered his mask, and told her the surgery had gone well, that her daughter would be moved into recovery in about an hour, and that June should try to rest before they let her go in. June said thank you, and she said it twice, then sat down and lowered her face into both hands. Her phone vibrated. It was her attorney, saying the board's letter had just been issued, and a digital copy was attached. June opened it right there in the hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of cartwheels rolling across the floor. The letter was 2 pages long, filled with references to statutes and provisions. Her eyes moved across without being able to absorb, until she reached the final line. The board concluded that the previous findings against Miss June Hollis had been issued on the basis of false information, that every adverse notation in her record was to be removed, and that her professional license was fully restored, effective as of the date of the order. June read that line 3 times. Then she closed the phone, rested her head against the wall behind her, and in that hospital hallway close to noon, the woman who had spent 4 years cleaning floors sat completely still, because 2 things had been returned to her in the same morning, and she didn't know how to hold them both. That evening, after Winnie had fallen asleep peacefully in the recovery room, June opened the tin box again and took out the bank envelope she'd ignored that night in Nashville. Inside was the mortgage agreement for the house, signed 4 years earlier, only a few months after the day everything had fallen apart, and beneath it were the papers establishing a trust fund in Winnie Hollis's name. The amount wasn't large. It had never been enough to cover even half the cost of the surgery, and anyone who glanced at the hospital bill would have known that immediately. The old woman must have known it too. Tucked among the papers was a small handwritten note containing only a few lines. Ruth had written, "This is all Mom could gather, sweetheart. I know it isn't enough. I've added it up over and over," she wrote. "But I thought if someone could start you off with half, maybe you'd have enough strength to go looking for the other half." She wrote, "People don't need miracles, sweetheart. They just need one person willing to begin first." June sat on the plastic chair in the hospital hallway and understood why the house was being taken, understood that the woman who had braided her hair when she was 12 years old had died inside a house that no longer belonged to her, and that she'd hidden the truth for 4 years because she knew June would have refused the money if she'd known. The other half, June learned later, came from a community fund, and the woman who organized it was Rhonda Lindquist. The mother who had hated June for 4 years had gone from door to door through the very town that had once cursed her name, and she'd collected enough to cover what was missing. Rocco came to the hospital straight from court, still wearing his suit, and he stood outside the glass door looking in for a while, before June stepped into the hallway. She said, "She made it." He said, "So did you." Then he handed her a paper showing the schedule for his sentence, and he said, "Don't wait for me. I'm not asking you to do that, and I don't have the right to ask." June took the paper, folded it, and slipped it into her coat pocket. She said, "You don't get to decide for me who I wait for." 3 years later, on a bright morning filled with sunlight, an old car was parked across the street from the gate of a correctional facility. The woman leaning against the driver's door wore the uniform of a mobile emergency medical team, the kind that traveled to small towns without clinics, the places where the system was most likely to forget people's names. Beside her stood a healthy 7-year-old girl who couldn't keep her feet still, holding a handmade sign high above her head with the words, "Welcome home, Rocco," written across it in uneven letters, and in one corner she'd drawn a little cloth doll named Pepper. The man who walked through the gate carried a paper bag in one hand, with no car waiting for him and no one beside him, and when he saw that sign, he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk for a long time before crossing the street. This story leaves us with a few very simple things. A person's worth doesn't come from the work they do, the amount of money in their bank account, or the judgment the world has placed upon them. It comes from what they choose to do when someone needs them. Family isn't only the place we're born into. Sometimes family is the person who chooses us and stays. And the person who damages another life most deeply isn't always some cruel or evil figure. Sometimes it is simply someone signing a page they couldn't be bothered to read, which means every careless thing we do today may become a burden someone else has to carry for years. Living with kindness and doing our work carefully are already ways of protecting other people. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How did this story make you feel? And what part stayed with you the most? Please leave a few lines in the comments. We truly want to hear what moved you deep inside your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, peaceful days, and happiness in every moment. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.